My life was a simple one. I was a sophomore studying computer science, and I lived alone in an apartment that wasn't far from school. I was a straight-A student, and the other students looked up to me. My best friend Kate was the only person I hung out with. My life was simple, at least to people who didn't know my secret. I was a hacker, a professional one, and I was making a lot of money duping people on the dark web. Using a complex algorithm, I had managed to set up some sites that asked for personal information. Once a person put in their email, I could hack their device location and tell them exactly where they were. Most people hated the lack of privacy, so I always put up a second option. All they had to do was unsubscribe from the mailer list. Once they clicked on that, they would be notified that their device was being corrupted with a virus and that they had to buy an antivirus. 3 out of 5 people caved in and sent the money, making me richer. The money was sent to an online mobile money app that couldn't be traced back to me. I was living a good life and was taking good care of myself. My laptop lit up with a message and I smiled, eager to have more money. I sent in the usual message, informing the person of their location. I frowned. The person wasn't living very far from me. I shrugged and sent in the second option. The user accepted to receive the code, and I sent it and waited for it to be sent back. After the usual message of the virus, the person went silent. That meant the user didn't fall for it. I was still staring at my laptop when my phone lit up with a message. I hurried to it, thinking it was Kate. It was an unknown number, and the message read, "Who the hell do you think you are?" I sent back a reply asking who it was. "I know what you're doing on the dark web." A chill passed through me and my hands started to shake. How was this possible? "What do you want?" I texted back. "Money." I was being blackmailed and there was nothing I could do about it. I gritted my teeth as I accepted the offer. I sent the money and hoped that that would be the end of it. I decided to quit my dark web scamming and just focus on school. After all, I had more than enough money to survive. Being caught took away the thrill. The next week, I woke up to a message from the person who blackmailed me asking for more money. I replied in the negative. "Your name is Laura. You're in your second year and you live close to the university." I screamed in anger, wondering how the person knew so much. I didn't even know if it was a guy or a girl. I sent the money reluctantly. I didn't want my secret out in the open. The next day, the same message came in. This time, I flat out ignored it. I was nobody's bank. I refused to reply, and hopefully the person would get the hint and leave me alone. A knock on my front door made me jump. I crept slowly and peeked through the peephole. I sighed in relief. It was just Kate. I opened the door for her, glad to see a familiar face. I hugged her and invited her in. She held her phone up and said, "You really thought no one would find out?" "What's that?" I came closer to her phone and I saw a message, the same message I had just received a while ago. Kate was the person blackmailing me. "Kate, how could you?" She rolled her eyes and demanded that I give her $1,000 if I wanted her to keep her mouth shut. I shook my head firmly. No way, I was so angry. I thought she was my friend. Even if she had found out about it, she could have just asked me. "Get out," I pointed to the door. "Not until you give me my money. I'll scream." I laughed, mirthless, and told her to get out. She opened her mouth and started to scream. I jumped on her, covering her mouth. We both fell down. I was on top of her, my hands still over her mouth. Her blue eyes were wide as she buckled underneath me. I pressed down on her even harder. Her hand came up, slapping me in the face, hitting my chest, but I refused to move. I had some extra pounds on her and I was using it to my advantage. Her hands reached up and grabbed my neck. She squeezed, cutting off my air. I had to release her mouth to tug her hands off me. I gasped when I managed to pry her hands off. Kate pushed me up and rolled over till she was on top of me. I was still trying to get enough air in. She punched me and my eyes watered. I struggled under her, but she wouldn't budge. She punched me again and I got enraged. I pushed her with my hands and she tumbled back. I ran to my kitchen and I pulled out a knife. I turned back to her, motioning to the door with the knife. We were both panting heavily and I told her to leave my house, and she looked at me with hatred in her eyes. Kate didn't move from her spot, and I started to wonder why she was so particular about getting the money. I walked slowly to get with the knife outstretched, and I told her to leave if she didn't want to get hurt. When she realized that my threat was real, she made her way to the front door and let herself out without glancing back. I let the knife clatter to the floor and held my head in my hands. I was about to stab my best friend. What kind of person was I? For the next few days, I didn't leave my apartment. I spent my time staring at nothing. My confrontation with Kate kept flashing through my mind. My phone rang and I picked it up without looking at who was calling. I sat up suddenly. No, she can't be dead, no! I dressed up hurriedly and I rushed out. I felt really numb as I hailed a cab to Kate's dorm. A crowd was gathered in front and my heart sank. Just as I got to them, I saw a stretcher being wheeled through the crowd. Kate was on it and her wrist had been slashed. I fell to the ground, my legs had turned to jelly. Kate killed herself. I later got to find out that she had a brain tumor and was supposed to go to surgery but couldn't because she didn't have enough money. I blamed her death on myself, and it was a scar I knew that I would carry for a long time. "Jade!" my friend Haley screamed. She wrapped me with a hug and we both squealed, excited to meet during the weekend. We waited for Sophie, our other friend. We had been best friends since high school and we were still as close as ever. "Girls!" Sophie squealed as she came to meet us. As one, we walked to the hotel, aware of the heads that turned our way. We were all pretty and we knew it. I fluffed my blonde hair as we walked inside the hotel and we all giggled. I worked as a model while Haley and Sophie worked as social media influencers. We were all doing well in our jobs and we were quite popular. As we caught up on things in our lives, we reminisced on our high school life. I was pretty proud of my past, and it was what shaped me up to be who I am presently. I lived a life only a few people my age could afford. "Remember all those girls with braces?" Haley asked. She fluttered her eyelids at the waiter that served us food, and he blushed before walking away quickly. I nodded, snorting. It had been our delight to make their lives miserable. Many times we had been reported as bullies. It didn't matter though. We now were successful ladies. After the meal, we got into our cars and drove to our respective homes. A call woke me up and I reached over for my phone. It was Haley and she sounded panicked. "What do you mean she was injured?" I asked, aghast. Haley explained to me that Sophie was in a bad condition and gave me the address of the hospital. I drove there in a panic. My mind was coming up with various scenarios. I winced when I saw Sophie's face. Her face was bruised and her front 2 teeth were missing. She was crying silently when I came in. Haley met my eyes and grimaced. I tried to comfort her, but she was worried about her teeth and how it had ruined her appearance. I told her she would just fix in artificial ones, and she seemed to calm down a little. I asked her how it happened, and she dissolved into tears again. She said she went to get something at the supermarket close to her house and had just entered her compound when a masked man tackled her to the ground. He had covered her mouth so she could not scream for help. It was dark enough that there was no one around. He used pliers to pull out her teeth and she went unconscious. I shook my head in horror, unable to comprehend why anyone would do that. I left Sophie, promising to check on her the next day. Haley and I kept coming back to check on Sophie and offer any assistance we could. "You mean Haley hasn't been here this morning?" I asked Sophie. She shook her head in the negative and I frowned. That was strange. We always met at the hospital. I decided to call her. It got picked up the second time. The person on the other end told me that Haley was badly injured and was waiting for an ambulance. I could hardly believe it. I rushed out without telling Sophie anything and just drove to Haley's place. The ambulance beat me there and I followed them back to the hospital. I stopped in my tracks as I saw her. Haley's front teeth were missing. Oh no! I drove back home with shaking hands. I was convinced I was the next target. First it was Sophie, then Haley. It was more than coincidence. Someone was attacking us. I parked in front of my house and got down. The bushes in front of my house rustled and I paused. I took a deep breath and waved it off as paranoia. I walked up to my door and fished for my keys. I entered my house and was about to close the door when it got wrenched from my hands. I staggered back, dazed. A masked man entered and closed the door. I started to shake. It was my turn. I stood my ground watching as he approached me. I feinted left and dashed for the door. He caught my 2 feet before I reached the entrance, and he dragged me by my waist. I screamed and I reached my hands for his head. His mask came off during the struggle and I turned to see his face. The shock of his eyes meeting mine stalled his actions enough that I jerked out of his hands and ran outside. I hopped in my car and drove to the nearest police station. I told him what had happened and they put out a search warrant. I was still coming to terms with what happened. I recognized the man that attacked me. His name was Simon. We went to the same high school. I could not mistake him for someone else. The three of us used to make fun of him because his front teeth were missing. Now he was out for revenge, and I was the last one on his list. I didn't sleep in my place that night, but instead lodged in a hotel. The next evening, I went to my place with the thought that Simon could not be stupid enough to come to my apartment again. I sighed as I closed the door and dropped my keys on the table. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of juice. Jade. I froze, cup to my lips. I slowly turned to see Simon looking at me. My legs gave out and I fell, glass cup shattering on the floor. Please, I choked out, crawling away. Simon laughed and pulled out his pliers. My face went pale and I screamed in horror. There was no way I would let him pull out my teeth. I stood up shakily and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I ran all the same. His footsteps were just behind me, but I had an advantage. It was my house and I was very familiar with it. I dashed into my room and I dove under my bed. I covered my mouth with my hands to conceal the sounds that were escaping. I saw his shoes pause in front of my room as he wondered where I was. He entered the room and tears ran down my face. My heart was beating so loudly such that I was sure it would alert him. He came over to the bed and he threw the covers down. Then he chuckled and he knelt down. I'd laid there frozen in fear. Just then, sirens blared. He cursed as he quickly rushed up and ran out. I remained under the bed for a long time. I came out when I was sure that it was safe. I met the police in my living room. Simon escaped before they got to my apartment.
I threw away the used tissues and sighed loudly. I was tired of moping around, crying over someone who didn't want me. My boyfriend broke up with me 2 weeks ago and it had been difficult for me. Stanley had been the one person that I loved wholeheartedly, and for him to tell me he found someone else was a blow to my heart. I was 24 and it felt like I had finally found stability after graduating from college. Stanley and I used to talk about the plans we had for our lives. It had been so easy to talk to him, and now he was gone. I shook my head to arrest my line of thoughts. I was almost out of tissue and couldn't afford to start crying again. I paced across my room for a few minutes. I lived alone, so there was no one to talk to. I grew bored after a while and my gaze landed on my laptop. I fired it up and decided to go to the dark web. I had been hearing a lot about it and it wouldn't hurt to see for myself. My face scrunched up in disgust as I browsed through the contents on the dark web. I was completely grossed out, and when I stumbled on a site claiming they could organize orgies, I shut down my laptop. I resolved never to go back there again. At least my curiosity had been satisfied. Taking that step had given me something else to think about, so I was able to take my mind off Stanley. The rest of the days passed by in a blur, and I didn't spend time crying and feeling sorry for myself. I decided to take myself out, so I went to a nice restaurant not far from my house. The decor was beautiful, and I enjoyed every minute of it. It wasn't very expensive, and the food tasted quite nice. I tipped the waiter generously. As I was leaving, my phone lighted up with a message. How was the food in that restaurant? I halted in my tracks, glancing around, trying to see if I was being pranked. The message was from an unknown number. I had no clue who it could be since I didn't tell anyone I would be going out. A thought came to my mind, and it could be a marketing message. Perhaps they wanted me to leave a review. I shrugged and ignored the message, walking back to my place. The next morning, I stayed in bed and watched Sex Education on Netflix. It helped me keep my mind off thinking about Stanley. Just as I finished watching it, a message entered my phone. Adam ain't that huge, is he? My heart started to beat faster. It was the same number that asked me about the food the other day. What was going on? The messages didn't stop. One evening, as I closed the cab door and paid the driver, my phone pinged again. It asked how the cab ride was. At that point, I didn't know what to feel anymore. I felt violated because it suddenly seemed like I had no privacy anymore. Colgate is the right toothpaste for you. I read the message and stared at myself in the mirror. I was going crazy with all the messages I was receiving. I spat out the toothpaste in my mouth and glared at the Colgate tube. My mood had turned sour after that. It had only gotten worse the next day when I planned to go out. As I was dressing up, another message came in. Your rack looks great in that red bra. I screamed in annoyance as I read the message. I removed my red bra in anger and wore a black one. How exactly did this person know what I was wearing? I constantly looked over my back, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out who was stalking me. It felt like they were right beside me. How did the person know I used Colgate toothpaste? Or the color of the bra I was wearing? It was getting intense for me, and I didn't know who to talk to. They would probably think I was going crazy. I couldn't take it anymore. I was on my way to see a private detective. I thought I could handle it, but just that morning I had received 3 messages from the same weird number. The first one said that I should eat more instead of just taking Cheerios. I had thrown my cereal bowl away in frustration. The second one came later in the morning, and it was reminding me to drink water because I had not been taking enough water. The last one that broke my resolve and endurance was sent just an hour ago. I had just finished taking a shower and changed into some comfortable clothes. The message said, "Wear the red one. You look amazing in red." After that, I had gone out with one purpose in mind. I had to find someone to help me. The private detective looked at me with a warm smile. He seemed to be in his 30s and had no wedding band. I narrated my plight to him, and he heaved a deep sigh. He said he had a good idea what was going on, but wouldn't like to jump to conclusions. He followed me back home and held out some kind of device. He ran the device over my place and shook his head every time it beeped, which was a lot. When he was done, he told me that my house was bugged, and that was the reason why that person knew everything I was doing. Your whole house has micro cameras rigged around, and your online activity is being monitored. I could arrange for it to be cleaned out for you if you want. I shook my head and politely declined. For my house to have been planted with cameras meant the person knew my location. I thanked the private detective and paid him the money I promised. Within me, I was sure it was because of the dark web that I visited that day. There was only one way I knew I could fix the mess I was in. That night, as I got home, I packed up all my things so I could leave town the next morning. I wouldn't let some psychopath mess with my mind. The person was obviously deriving joy from harassing me, and I couldn't let that continue. I changed my phone and my laptop and got a new place in the next town. I never visited the dark web again, and even though I got scared when I received a message on my phone, I knew that I would be all right. Starting a new life in a different town was quite challenging, but I knew I would do my best.